It is often said that the Gothic genre is unusual in its ability to trace its origins so clearly. In a parallel vein, Gothic studies as a field studying that genre traces its origins to a story set in the 1920s and the 1930s, a story containing its own founding heroes and villains, and coalescing around a founding myth of disrepute, canonical rejection, and after a long struggle by our heroic forebears, an eventual retrospective discovery. It's also often said that the general knowledge about a subject reaches the consensus stage when it gets its Cambridge History of X. The Gothic novel achieved this milestone in 2020 with the 3-volume Cambridge History of the Gothic. This was a monumentally important work, but it happens to leave out part of the story, because it turns out that the founding myth of Gothic studies isn't really true. In my short time with you today, I want to show that 2 historical assumptions of our field ought to be seriously questioned. The first is that the Gothic novel was a belated and retrospective category, and the second is the texts we now place in that category were ignored by respectable literary history until the 20th century. The version of the Gothic historiography that we all know in these terms would begin in 1921 with Edith Burkhead's The Tale of Terror. Up until the 20th century, most histories of the Gothic included an almost ritualistic expression of gratitude to these early pioneers, so I refer to them as the founding heroes. Later consolidation points, there were several in the 20th century, but if I had to map them, these are the ones that were the most important. And as I said, in the 21st century, that's going to be the most important. However, we don't really know all that much about before this. So we know a lot about the texts, the novels themselves, but we don't really know all that much about the history of the Gothic novel as was written sort of before those first consolidation points by the founding heroes. So largely my dissertation was about figuring out what, if anything, had been said. I initially started just trying to verify the truth of the myth and very quickly realized that it wasn't true. And so the project became about uncovering what there was. I had to kind of go looking at first. I didn't really know where to begin, so I had to kind of have some ideas about where I would look. So I was thinking, contemporary reviews of the novels, what were dictionaries saying about the Gothic novel, what would a literary encyclopedia say, what would a consolidated general literary history product say, and what books were written on the subject. And all of those would sort of, become the consolidated history of the Gothic. Um, as far as what this would actually look like, so 19th century would be basically the era. The Gothic novel was published from 1764 to 1820 was its first wave. So that means most of the stuff that I would have been looking at was when did it sort of get picked up in the 19th century. Um, the contemporary reviews to the text themselves are well covered in the scholarship, so I didn't really look at those very much. For dictionaries, it did end up being very fruitful, but 20th century dictionaries turned out to be more important. And the monographs on Romanticism arrived too late. They didn't really start until the late 1800s. The literary encyclopedias were highly relevant, but there isn't time to talk about this today. So today, mostly I'm just going to talk about the general consolidated literary histories. The first scholarly lexical mention of the term Gothic novel as a critical term, according to current scholarship, was in 1899. I was able to push this back 10 years earlier, which was interesting, but that doesn't fundamentally kind of change the consensus. What is important, though, is that the term Gothic novel, it'd be more productive to look at the first mention of Gothic romance. And once I did that, it turned out that that term sort of was in use as early as 1859. which is already considerably earlier than what we had realized. So to kind of situate this on a timeline, the founding heroes there are 1920s era. 1820 is when the last kind of first wave Gothic novel was published. So that means we're sort of already kind of just right in the middle there, and I've already pushed it back halfway. But there were a whole bunch more. There was another general literary history earlier than that, 1835. Another one prior to that, 1832. And then the biggest surprise about this was that the first one was 1814, which was actually before the publication of the Gothic novel was over. That was a major finding because in all the time that the Gothic was sort of written about, nobody had ever really discovered that. It turned out to be simple once I sort of knew what I was doing, but nobody ever really thought to do this before, and a lot of that had to do with when those earlier histories were written, they didn't have access to the databases and research libraries that we do now. And by the time those resources came along, the story was so entrenched that it didn't occur to anybody to look. So I was the first one to look, and so I found it. And that turns out there was enough material there to make a dissertation. So thank you very much.